So thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. Tonight's presentation is the first in our series of our urban forestry education webinars. Tonight's presentation will be on tree biology. For any additional webinars that are upcoming, you can visit our website at ccenassau.org for a full listing of all the webinars. These webinars will also be recorded and will be posted on our website afterwards at ccenassau.org. For any questions about the webinars or the recordings, you can email us at ccenassau@cornell.edu. We will be saving all of our questions till the end. If you have questions that you would like to ask, you can submit them through the question and answer function, or you can submit them through the chat function for everyone to see. Right now, everyone is muted and has their cameras off, and that's the way we will leave it for the remainder of the webinar. If you do have any questions, just send them in the chat and we'll ask those at the end. There will be some ISA CEU credits that are provided for these webinars. If you would like to receive credit for these, you must provide your full name and your ISA certification number at the end of the webinar. If you guys need a minute right now to go look for your numbers, find your cards, you may do so now. So that way we don't have to spend time looking for them at the end of the webinar. The support for these urban forestry webinars comes from the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation through their Urban and Community Forestry Program. If you guys have any questions about the urban forestry program or would like to send a letter of support to the folks up at the DEC, you guys can send that to us at ccenassau@cornell.edu. And we'd be more than happy to forward those along to you. Once again, if anyone has any questions, submit them in the chat, but otherwise we'll be turning it over to Vinny.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and welcome everyone to our first of a series of urban forestry topics. We are starting with tree biology because I think it'll be appropriate for all of the upcoming presentations that we have planned. It's I'm trying to keep it basic and to the point, interesting and practical. This is definitely not a botany course or anything like that, and there will not be a test at the end, so you don't have to worry. It's really just practical information that I think would be useful for anyone who's interested in trees on your own property or trees in your community. So let's get started here, and here we go. So okay, so we're going to answer some questions. One of the questions that we're going to answer is, what is tree biology? What makes a plant a tree? Because all trees are plants, but not all plants are trees. We're going to talk about secondary growth and explain what that's about. And we're going to talk a little about what it all means. And to wrap it up, hopefully the takeaway for this program is why it's important to know about tree biology. So what is tree biology? Well, I guess the technical terminology we might use for it is the study of the life processes of a tree. And I'm sure everyone's probably experienced this somewhere along the line in the education system, high school biology and in other areas. Some of you I see from the list are Master Gardeners, so I'm sure you've come across some of this information in your Master Gardener classes. It's the study of the processes of a tree that includes a study of the growth, the structure, the evolution, etc. of a tree. So we're not going to get in a lot of great amount of detail. We only have an hour, so I'm going to try to zip through this as best as I can. So what makes a plant a tree? Like all other plants, trees are autotrophs, meaning they produce their own food. They do that through photosynthesis. Now, other organisms would be called heterotrophs, and those are organisms that depend on other living organisms as a food source. So we're we're heterotrophs, I'm sorry, because we eat plants, we also eat animals. There are a lot of heterotrophs that want to eat trees, and that's often the bane of their existence and our existence as folks who are trying to grow trees. So organisms like insects, fungus, bacteria, and the like are all trying to eat a tree for the nourishment that it provides. But trees are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food. And we're going to get into the process that they do that with. One thing that identifies trees is that tree cells have rigid cell walls. A large central vacuole, which that fancy word vacuole means basically that it is a membrane that holds everything together in the cell, kind of like the rubber of a balloon or a tire. It keeps everything inside. And an important part of what's inside the vacuole are chloroplasts. And chloroplasts contain chlorophyll, and that's an important element for the process of photosynthesis. But the real difference with trees is the secondary growth. And we're going to explain that in a minute. So what does secondary growth means? It means wood. Wood is something very unique to trees and shrubs, and I'll explain the difference. Trees and shrubs grow radially. They grow kind of sideways, outward. So they also grow upward, so vertically. So if you look at a cross section of a tree trunk, which we have in the photo on the right here, you can see the inside of a tree trunk, and what you're looking at is basically mostly wood with a very small section just inside of the bark, which is the living tissue inside here, which is called the cambium. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So that's what really differentiates trees from other plants. Most other plants, they do grow a little bit radially, but not for a very long time, often a year or maybe a few years. But because they do not have wood within their stem developing, they don't have the ability and the structure to live a long time. And that's what kind of gives trees their longevity, and shrubs. The difference between trees and shrubs, it's not clearly defined, but it is generally the size, the height, and the number of stems. Generally, a shrub is a plant that has a woody stem or multiple stems and reaches a height of typically less than 25 or 30 feet. More often, a shrub is thought of as something that is maybe 10 or 15 feet in height. Then they typically don't develop very wide stems like trees do when they develop their tree trunks, which there's one here to the right in the photo. So that's really the difference. And there's no real clearly defined definition for it, but it's a general way of describing those plants that can grow not only larger in height, but in width. And it's not unlimited. by any means. But we differentiate the multi-stemmed, shorter growing woody stem plants as shrubs. So that's really all you really need to know. But we're going to focus on mainly trees here on out. Here's an example of a tree. In the center of this photo is a pretty old tree. It's a 300-year-old white oak at Planet Fields Arboretum in Oyster Bay. And just think about how long that oak tree's been there, and kind of what it's gone through. It probably started its life from an acorn, a seed of an oak. And that was 300 years ago. So that was before, that was in colonial times. That was actually before probably we were not even, America wasn't even invented yet. That was quite a while ago, before the, United States was around. And just think of all the different things that tree has had to endure over that 300-year period. Maybe that, there was really nothing there. Maybe there wasn't anything but woodland or field. And maybe there was a farm there a little later on. And maybe there was a home. Now we know at Planting Fields it was an estate. But just think of all the changes that it had gone through, including all the different weather that it had to survive, and all the different other organisms that a tree has to endure, like the insects and the diseases and so on. So to me, it's pretty amazing. And the white oak trees, they're not the tallest growing trees in the Northeast, but they do get up there pretty high. They max out at maybe about 100, 120 feet tall, and maybe about as wide. But they reach that in probably the course of 50 to 75 years. And then they continue to grow. But what really grows on them is the width, the girth of the trunk and the branches. That's where the growth, that's the secondary growth that we're talking about. The trees don't grow forever, into the sky and up into the clouds. And they certainly don't grow, miles wide. They reach a limit, and yet they still continue to put on growth in the form of a wider and wider trunk and branches. That's basically the secondary growth, and what it achieves is these really wide trunks and branches as time goes on. And, it's unusual to see a 300-year-old tree here now in the United States on Long Island. If you go to Europe, you see trees that are sometimes much older, 500, 600, 800 years old. So, a lot of the trees were cut down in this area, in the surrounding areas for development or farming. So it's unusual to see this. So let's move on. So what does it all mean? Trees can live longer than other plants. Let's think of some of the other plants that we have. Annuals are plants that grow for one year, one growing season. Perennials, they grow for a number of years, but it's not unlimited. Oftentimes a perennial will grow for a number of years, a few years, and then they'll, a lot of times they've developed strategies for reproducing, like sending out underground shoots or being able to reseed themselves very prolifically. Trees differ than these other plants. We call them the herbaceous plants because they don't develop woody stems. So, they're pretty unique in the world of plants, trees, because they can live so long. They oftentimes get bigger than other plants, but, some of them, maybe not so much. There's a vast array of genetic diversity in the world of trees. There are trees that are also dwarf, smaller growing, and then there are larger growing trees that are sometimes very closely related in the same genus or species. So there's lots of genetic diversity and genetic potential as to how big a tree can grow, but they all have a known potential for the size that they'll get to. And then there'll be the secondary growth, which again adds girth to the trunk and the branches. For us as perhaps homeowners or gardeners or folks that are managing trees in a community situation, trees are a long-term investment. Think about that 300-year-old tree, or, even a tree that may be on your property that's, considered old, 50, 75, 100 years old on private property here on Long Island is probably considered a fairly old tree. But again, it's a long-term investment, but it's also, trees provide long periods of benefits. And we're not going to talk a lot about that. Maybe we'll do that in a future presentation. But trees do provide lots of important benefits to everyone in the community, as well as to the environment. So, but I don't want to digress into that. Trees are impacted by and respond to damage from pests, disease, and unfavorable environmental conditions. I put the term sometimes successfully. Probably maybe most of the time, trees can withstand, if they're in pretty good health and they're in a good environment and they're maybe given a little care, a lot of times they can kind of outgrow some of the problems that they developed, or they can live quite comfortably with having a few pest problems or an occasional bout with a disease. Just like with people, we all get infection and along the way, and if we're healthy and we take care of ourselves, we can fight it off and live on. So trees are very much the same way, and I often think of trees the same way, because as trees get older, a lot of times they do need a little bit more attention paid to their health. So we're going to talk about some of the things that impact trees in a few minutes, but let's move on with tree biology here. So some of the heterotrophs that are problems for tree are things like insects, diseases, even bacterial infections, viruses. Trees do get viruses. So here's gypsy moth. Just think what this particular insect does. If you're not familiar with gypsy moth, it is a caterpillar of a moth. It is present on trees in the spring, just about the time or just after the time they leaf out on the deciduous trees. They love deciduous trees, but they are also known to feed on some of the conifers, the evergreens, when there's no deciduous trees around. So they can really wreak havoc. A lot of times they're around in large numbers. And just think what they do. They eat the foliage, the leaves of trees, and they can devastate trees. They oftentimes will defoliate a tree, but a lot of times if a tree is in a pretty good state of health and environmental conditions are pretty good, there's plenty of resources like rainfall, and the tree has lots of nutrients that it's stored up, the tree will put out a second flush of leaves to survive. But repeated defoliations can lead to the decline of a tree. So, this is one of many pest problems that can sometimes be devastating to a population of trees. They happen to like oak trees, and we have a lot of oak trees on Long Island. Oaks are common in our wild wooded areas, as well as they're often used as street trees and on private properties as shade trees. So this is just one of many problems that trees are, may have to battle. Another problem that's coming our way, it's already here actually, is emerald ash borer, but in general, borers can wreak havoc on trees. Now the gypsy moths specialized in eating leaves. These particular insects and other borer insects like Asian longhorn beetle and a few others, in fact, there's many others that live just under the bark, between the bark and the wood of the tree, and they create these chambers, as you can see in the photo. And there's a photo of, on the right, on the top is a photo of the actual borer, which is the larva of the adult, which is on the bottom right here. This is an emerald ash borer. It gets its name from its green emerald color. But this is a devastating problem on ash trees, especially, and they're very specific to ash trees right now. We don't know if they're going to eventually find other trees to their liking, but it's devastating because this is the damage that it does. And basically it causes the tree to decline and die very quickly because of this, because it sort of cuts off the resources, the water, the nutrients that are being taken up by the roots, and it impedes the food that's being made in the leaves through photosynthesis, the sugars and carbohydrates. It impedes the movement of these resources through the trunk of the tree because of these chambers. So it's quite devastating of an insect pest. And other, like I said, Asian longhorn beetle is another devastating insect pest, and there's other borers as well. And then there are fungal problems. This is one of the leaf problems that are common to dogwood. This is dogwood anthracnose, and it causes these leaf spots. And there's many other fungal or bacterial leaf spot problems that are devastating to trees. Now, the impact here is that because the tree leaves are the part of the tree that is its purpose is focused on food production, every time a spot develops and enlarges on the leaf, it decreases the leaf surface, and therefore it decreases the tree's ability to produce food. So food production is greatly diminished when a tree is under siege from diseases like this. And then there are diseases that infect the branches and the trunk of trees. This is bacterial canker. It causes this oozing or bleeding of the sap. The infection is under the bark, and the bacteria feeds on the sugars that are in the sap of the tree, and it renders sections of the tree's branches and barks to die off. And if it totally encompasses the circumference of the tree, it can lead to the eventual death of the tree at worst, or just a branch or two might die off. But the infection can often continuously spread through the tree, so it can be rather devastating. And then there are other decay organisms which are fond of feeding on trees. They're other heterotrophs that don't produce food for themselves, like the fungi. These are mushrooms that are often indicative of decay in a tree. Mushrooms are the fruiting body of the fungus. The main body of the fungus is actually inside the roots and the trunk of the tree, the mycelium. It's hair-like structures that kind of tunnel their way into the living part of the tree as well as the wood of the tree. So it renders the tree unsafe. It destroys the structural integrity of the trunk and the roots, and is often associated with the reason why trees fall over in windstorms or topple over, even if there's no windstorms. So it's something to keep an eye on. And yes, just like COVID-19, there are viral infections that do some pretty weird things to trees. On the left are leaves of a cherry tree, which is showing the signs of a viral infection. This discoloration in a pattern on the leaf is often the sign of a viral infection. So trees do get viruses. The photo on the right is called a witch's broom. Viruses of different types can cause very abnormal growth. And this particular virus causing this witch's broom just causes a whole lot of shoot growth in a very short space area on a branch. And trees planted in situations where there's inadequate rooting space may decline and become hazardous because of the limited space that they're being provided with the root system for their root system. And we see this all the time. We have limited space for our trees. Oftentimes we're planting species that maybe are outgrow the space that they're provided. So, this is something to be on the lookout for. When they're in such situations, they often become weak and stressed out, and they often develop pest problems, diseases, decay. And so they very quickly decline and become hazardous in a very short period of time. And then there's sometimes things that we do or we don't do that can lead to the demise of a tree. This was a juniper that was planted maybe 15 years or so ago, and it was staked, and there was this wire that was wrapped with the rubber hose, a garden hose around it, but the owners failed to remove the wire stakes, and the tree tried to grow around it, but what happened was a strong wind came by and snapped the trunk of the juniper, and there inside the trunk was the guying wire and the rubber hose that should have been removed years ago. Usually we'd want to remove them about a year after planting so that we don't girdle the trunk like this. So let's talk a little bit about how trees grow. And we're going to cover cells, roots, trunk, branches, leaves, death and regeneration, what they do, how they grow, terms to know, and how they're affected by people. So if you didn't get a chance to read that little cartoon, it says, and see this right here, Jimmy? That's another time when the old fellow miraculously survived some big forest fire. So we know that these growth rings on the secondary growth of trees in the trunk can record time. Each ring is typically a year's worth of growth, and that sometimes the rings are larger and smaller, and sometimes that can indicate things that have been going on in the environment that the tree's been living in. Trees can't just get up and kind of run away from the forest fire, so they have to endure whatever comes their way, whether it's a fire or insects or pests, which is really pretty amazing when I think about it, how trees can endure so many problems and yet, survive. So talk a little bit about cells, what they do. They're the basic building block of plants and typically animals too. It's in the nuclei that the basic genetic information is found. Every tree species is different, so there's different genetic information in the nuclei. Cells are where food production happens. They derive energy from the production of sugars and starches. The process of creating this energy from food, such as sugar and starches, is known as respiration. It's the breaking down of the sugars and starches. The opposite of that is making food. It's the utilization of light energy through chlorophyll and the chloroplasts, which is food production. We're going to get a little bit more into the photosynthesis part of it. How cells grow. Cells in meristem tissue divide through mitosis. We're not going to get into any great detail about that, but just know that cells are continuously dividing within a tree, and the meristem tissue is found in the tips of the shoots, in roots, and in the cambium tissue, which is the living tissue just under the bark of a tree and on the outside of the wood of a tree. So we're going to explain how that happens. But cambium tissue contains the living part of the tree. The rest of it, the bark and the wood, is dead or almost dead. It still functions in some types of the wood, like the sapwood, but it eventually does clog up and becomes heartwood. And we're going to look at that in a minute. Cells differentiate into various tissues. So, cells become all different parts of the plant, the leaves, the buds, like I said, the bark and the wood, the roots. So there's a lot of specialized development that these cells turn into to serve the needs of the tree. Everything begins with bud break in the spring, and it depends on the species, the climate, the moisture, the daylight length, and so on, in how fast or slow or what kind of growth they produce. So there's lots of variation in that. Here's a diagram of a cell. It's the cell wall, the very first one listed there on the top, on the right-hand side, the cell wall, which kind of differentiates the plants and trees from the animals and the other organisms. The cell wall contains cellulose. Eventually, the cells in the cell wall lignifies or becomes lignin, which is what makes wood. The cell membrane is the part, the vacuole that keeps everything together. It keeps the water and all of the other parts of a cell safely inside. There you see the nucleus, the mitochondria, which is responsible for the breaking down of the sugars and starches and releasing energy. And then you'll see the chloroplasts, which is where the photosynthesis happens, and it contains the chlorophyll. So it's very, kind of all encompassing. And then these multiply within the stems and all parts of the tree, the leaves and the roots, to create the tree. So in trees, wood and bark is comprised of cellulose and lignin. Lignin is a polymer that's made of organic matter, and it gives wood its strength and its stiffness. So when the plant cells within a tree trunk lignify, they become hard and solid, and they supply the physical structural strength of a branch or a trunk of a tree. We'll move on to roots. We'll start at kind of the microscopic diagram of roots. Root hairs are the smallest structure on a root. As you can see here on the right in this diagram, you have the main part of the root, but coming off laterally are the root hairs. They're probably maybe the most important part of the root, because they're the part that absorbs water and nutrients from the soil. Basically, the nutrients are dissolved in the water and soil. We call it the soil solution. And the root hairs are the structure that does the absorption of this soil solution. So if the root hairs are damaged by drying out and dehydrating, exposure to the air, again, the roots are in the soil, they're in a moist environment. But if you take a tree's roots out of the soil and the root hairs are damaged, the tree really struggles to absorb water and nutrients. So that's why it's important to know about the root hairs. The mycorrhiza is actually a fungus that lives on the root. It lives on, some mycorrhiza lives on the outside of the root in the root hairs, It helps the roots absorb water and nutrients from the soil. The mycorrhiza oftentimes helps to dissolve the mineral components of the soil into usable forms of the mineral for the benefit of the tree to use. Some mycorrhiza actually uh, lives within the root itself, lives in between the cells of the root. The mycorrhiza lives in a symbiotic relationship with the root. It increases the surface of the root, helping the root to find more water and minerals, elements that it would maybe not be able to find if it wasn't, the mycorrhiza wasn't there. The mycorrhiza lives in this symbiotic relationship. What the plant gives to the mycorrhiza is sugars. So the mycorrhiza is a heterotroph. So it lives for the benefit of the tree's roots, but it also depends on the foods that the tree's leaves produce, and the tree shares it with the mycorrhiza. So there's this beneficial relationship that we're learning about now, and we recognize now that is important for healthy tree and really all kinds of plant growth in the soil. There's a whole world of living organisms that live in the soil that benefit each other. And so it's important to know that, and it's important to have that mycorrhiza. It's naturally occurring in soils. It's important to keep that healthy and doing what it's doing. The soil interface is where the exchanges occur. It's really, it depends highly on having the right soil texture, which is the relationship of the different particle sizes, like for instance, sand, silt, and clay in a soil. It also includes the organic matter in the soil, including the mycorrhiza and other beneficial organic living organisms. The texture also is related to the pore space. Pore space is, I want to say empty space, but it's not ever empty. It either contains air or water, or it's in flux. It's constantly changing. So pore space in soil is very important because it's where the water and the air, the oxygen, carbon dioxide exchange goes on. And it's also where nutrients are absorbed by the root system. And it's important for good, healthy growth. So that's why it's important that when you plant anything, that you have a good soil for that plant to grow in, so that it can take advantage of all of the benefits that a good soil can provide the root system of a tree or a shrub or any kind of a plant. So the main functions of the roots, so they absorb water and element nutrients from the soil solution. They anchor the tree in the soil, and roots actually do a lot of food storage in the form of sugars, in the form of starch for future use. So trees often during the summer, especially in the late summer, spend a lot of their energy producing food and moving that food down into the root system to survive the winter and then to provide energy for new growth in the spring. That's kind of it in a nutshell. The diagram on the right, the top diagram kind of shows what I would say would be what people think of as the classic diagram of the size of the root system compared to the canopy of the tree. But actually the diagram below that, diagram B, is in reality what actually occurs in reality. Tree roots actually develop and grow sometimes much wider than the canopy of a tree. And often that's for several reasons. One reason would be to find resources like water and nutrients. Another reason would be to provide stability. Um, so, when you're thinking about planting a tree or you're caring for a tree, the roots are the part of the tree that we often don't see. It's hidden underground, but it's very important. And it's important for you to realize that your tree roots may extend way beyond the canopy of the tree. And here's a diagram, a little more detail of what's underground. The taproot, oftentimes people think the taproot grows long and is as deep as the height of the tree, but in reality, taproots do appear on young trees. Typically, it's a result of the seed germinating and putting down a taproot in the beginning of the young tree's life. But oftentimes, trees most often kind of lose their taproot. So oftentimes when you do excavate a tree out, you won't find a taproot. There's not a lot of trees that have a extensive taproot. Most of the time, the growth of the new roots is lateral. So the lateral roots, B, which would be these that are coming off of the base of the trunk of the tree, are the important ones, and they're the ones that follow. They're very dense near the surface. The surface typically has more moisture in it and lots more oxygen, so you tend to get a lot more tree root growth near the surface. As you go deeper, there's less oxygen, and sometimes there's even less water, and it may not there may not be a lot of because there's not a lot of oxygen, there's not a lot of root growth. But there are these roots that deeply descend to find water and nutrients at times when there may be a drought up near the surface. So trees are pretty intelligent in that they know and they develop a root system near the surface where moisture and oxygen levels are typically mostly always higher, but they do have these other roots that they develop that go down deeper in search of water and nutrients as well. So, how are roots affected by people? Proper planting and watering, limited root space, girdling roots, soil compaction, severing roots, and mulch. We saw some photos of the poor conditions growing in that oftentimes street trees are planted in, that limited root space. I'm going to show you, we're going to cover some of these other problems that roots run into. Again, remember 80% of the root system is in the top 18 inches of the soil. Typically, this is what you would see when you excavate out a wooded area. Roots are opportunistic. They seek out moisture and oxygen in the upper soil layers. Roots can grow 3 to 5 times the width of the crown. So, typically when you see a tree like falls over, but gets blown over maybe by a storm, the tree typically develops this big pancake-shaped root system, and that's quite normal for a well-established tree. Trees a lot of times blow over because the wind speeds lately with a lot of these storms are exceeding the what the trees have been genetically designed to withstand. Typically 75-mile-per-hour winds and higher are not the norm for a tree. So a lot of times they're toppled over, and a lot of times it's attributed not because the tree broke or the trunk snapped. It's because of the soil and the soil failure, or perhaps conditions of the soil may be such that the soil saturated, or that it's a very light soil, very sandy. So this tree happened to be right at the edge of a driveway to the left. And so it really didn't develop a very extensive root system because of that. So limited rooting space, like I said, can really be a problem with a lot of trees because the roots are a very important part of a healthy tree. And sometimes we want to do things like we want to save every tree in a situation. This is a new home being built, but this tree's got a lot of problems. It was a tree that was growing in a forest, more of a wooded or forested area. Construction equipment has kind of compacted the soil around it, reducing the ability of the soil to absorb water and hold air. And so the root system has been compromised. And a lot of times these are the trees that going into the future don't do very well. What can be done about this? A little forethought. If you want to preserve trees on a property, you need to protect their root system. So you need to put up barriers that keep construction equipment off of its root system and prevent the heavy equipment and trucks and other vehicles from like bulldozers and backhoes from compacting that soil. So these are things that affect a tree and tree roots that we can have some influence on. So let's talk a little bit about the trunk. The trunk of a tree provides support for the branches and the crown. It's the vertical growth of a tree that gets it up into the sunlight. So the trunk has to transport water and minerals, up to the crown. And the food that is made in the crown, through photosynthesis in the leaves, downward movement into the root system. So it's a kind of a plumbing system, moving water, nutrients, as well as the sugars and starches that are made up in the canopy of the tree throughout the tree. So I wouldn't say it's just up and down, it's up and down and sideways, the movement of all of these resources. The trunk does store organic matter in the form of the sugars. And as we know, trees sequester carbon in the wood by absorbing carbon dioxide and turning it into wood, basically, that stays sequestered for, sometimes hundreds of years. Wood can actually change. The growth inside of a tree can actually change to deal with decay. We call it coated. Coated is compartmentalization of decay in trees. That's what coated stands for. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And with age, a tree trunk does lose some of its ability to transport and store the resources. So the older a tree gets, the more that slows down. But, like I said, some trees can grow, hundreds of years and function quite well if the environment is right and the resources are there. Let's take a cross-section look at a tree trunk. The outer bark is also known as the periderm. It's comprised mostly of cellulose. It's the secondary growth from the cambium, which is that ring that's right here, the little bit darker ring right here. The cambium tissue contains meristem cells that produce two types of cells. To the outside of the cambium, it produces the phloem, which moves food produced in the leaves in the canopy of the tree throughout the tree. So that's to the outside. To the inside, xylem is produced. Xylem is the conductive tissue that water and nutrients that are being pulled up by the roots moves up and down the tree as well. As it gets older and as more newer xylem and tissue is produced, the old tissue gets pushed. It doesn't actually get pushed, but it becomes more located in the central of the tree, central part of the trunk, and it develops into the heartwood. The heartwood is the xylem that is not functioning anymore. With age, it gets clogged up, and but it does provide an important function of providing structure to the tree. The bark, the outer bark that's developed from the phloem when it gets older, provides protection to the cambium. So the bark is important to be um, kept intact so that the cambium tissue is protected. And when insects or injury damages the bark and therefore damages the cambium tissue, that's when trees start to develop some problems like decay or pests get in there. So it's all important, but those are the important segments of a tree trunk. I'm not going to get into this too much, but again, the meristem tissue in the cambium provides the new cells for the xylem and the phloem development, and therefore the development of bark and the heartwood. Cells not only grow radially or horizontally, but they elongate. Carbon is stored in the wood tissue that develops inside the trunk of the tree. Geotropism is a term you might want to be familiar with. It's the tree's sensitivity to gravity that causes the tree to grow up into and away from the ground and into the sky, so to speak, or in the direction of the sky. And it also causes the root system to grow downward. In the trunk, there are chemical changes that occur when there is damage done to the trunk that helps the tree resist decay. And again, it's called compartmentalization. I'm going to get into that in a minute. Tree rings kind of develop and record the yearly growth. When you look at a cross-section of a tree, you'll see the tree rings, and there'll be a lighter and a darker section for each year. The early wood growth is the growth in the spring. It's usually larger or wider, and it's a lighter colored cell. And later on in the season, when growth diminishes a bit, late wood cells develop, which are smaller and tighter and create more of a darker appearance. So each of these dark and light rings represents 1 year's worth of growth. And you can tell how well growth and how well the tree was doing in any particular year by how wide the rings are. So that will be based on resources, rainfall, nutrients, temperatures, changes in the climate, so on and so forth. Some of the ways trees are affected by people is wounding, girdling, tree staking, exposure to weather. An example of this wounding is improper pruning. This is what happens when someone attempts to remove a branch for whatever reason it was and doesn't use the proper technique and winds up with a section of bark that got ripped off and exposed the inner softwood and hardwood down below. So that is a really bad thing to do. So proper pruning technique, which we're not going to cover now, would have prevented that. So that's sometimes things that happen. You know, we've been tapping maple trees for maple syrup production for years, and these maple trees heal themselves through the process of compartmentalization. Here in the photo shows where the taps were years ago and how they've this tree is compartmentalized the damaged part from the taps that went in years ago, and it's totally encompassed these wounds. So maple, these maple trees are tapped year in and year out, and yet because they have good resources, they're in a great environment, they do heal themselves quite readily. Some other problems that trees have is from improper planting. The photo in the upper left here shows the proper root flare. This is where the roots and the trunk meet. You want this to be exposed just like it is here. It's very important to see that on a tree. Um, and it's important not to see this on a tree. When we see flat-sided and we don't see any kind of a root flare, that often indicates that there's a problem down below. It could be that there's roots that are wrapping around, like what you see here on the bottom left, um, that are girdling the tree, causing it not to expand. Or it could be that there's soil compaction in this area, or it could have been that the tree was planted too deep. That's this bottom right-hand picture. Trees that are planted too deep, which is a very common problem, they often develop these secondary or tertiary roots that try to develop a little bit near the surface, because the tree root ball was planted way too deep in soil that probably lacked a lot of moisture and oxygen. The tree does try to compensate for that by producing these roots, but a lot of times they are very unhealthy and they cause the girdling of the tree trunk. See, this very straight. So whenever you see this in a tree trunk where you don't see a this nice taper, we've got problems. So let's just. And then there are other problems with not removing guying wires and people tying, things to the tree, or, on the right here, this bench, which looks like this tree's eating this bench here, but that's, what trees do. If there's something in their way, and if they're healthy and they are growing vigorously, they will encompass objects a lot of times. But, these guy wires not being removed, that really cuts off nutrient and resources like water and nutrients and food from going up and down the trunk. And eventually it either kills the upper portion of the tree, or it becomes a very weak area that sometimes breaks. So these are things that are to be avoided. And sometimes things like this happen. This is a bicycle that was, the story goes, the legend of this bicycle goes that it was put up in the tree by a young man who was sent off to serve in World War I in 1914. And here it is to this day, still in the tree. So the tree just adapted to it and grew around it. Of course, it didn't restrict the growth of the tree much. It actually encompassed the bicycle. So these are some of the weird things that can happen with a tree. And sometimes the tree can deal with it and sometimes it can't. Trees sometimes are exposed to problems. This is a frost crack or sun scald. I don't know which one it is, but it's often caused by fluctuating temperatures on one side of the tree. Usually it's sun beating on one side of the tree that kills off the cambium tissue below, or it can actually, a frost crack can occur, whereas on the moisture inside of the tree freezes during the winter, and then on a sunny warm day it warms up one side of the tree, and the difference in the pressure can actually split a tree open. Trees do try to heal themselves through compartmentalization, but some effort could have been taken to protect this tree by using a protective tree wrap on this tree and preventing frost cracks and sun scald. So, there are some things that sometimes we can do when planting a tree that can help prevent some problems like this from developing. A lot of times these do heal themselves and the tree continues on and lives a long, healthy life. And sometimes it's a source of infection for other organisms like decay and insects. So we're going to talk a little bit about coated. This is an example of how it happens. The trees inside the trunk will often develop tissue that prevents the decay from moving into the healthier part of the wood, like in this section here. This is a longitudinal cut on a trunk that did have some decay in it, and how this tree totally was hollow inside, and yet it was still pretty sound because of coated. The structural integrity of the tree was still intact. So the coated sets up these protective walls. The walls are vertical as well as horizontal, and they also prevent lateral decay. So if you look at this bottom diagram here, you can see here how the decay has been totally encompassed by this tree, and how here in section number 4, good healthy growth began to develop years after this decay set in. So that's the way the trees heal themselves. Totally important for, issues when there's cankers or when there's physical damage to a trunk like this. Having damage like this where there's multiple locations really reduces the flow of resources up and down the tree trunk, as well as food from the canopy. So it's important to keep the tree healthy, remove any loose bark or wood, and then just let the tree heal itself. We don't recommend using tree wound paint anymore. And this is the goal. It's to have the callus tissue form over the old wounds. And here's some old wounds, some branches that were removed with the proper cuts, and they're almost all totally covered over with this callus tissue growth. Let's move into stems. Buds provide the new growth area for both foliage and flowers. The terminal bud at the tip here, it actually produces hormones that suppress the growth of the buds down below. So what you should know is that if you remove the terminal bud, you're removing the hormone that reduces the growth of these lateral buds down below. And so that releases them and they grow. So where you had one bud here, you'll have 2 shoots growing here. Dormant buds, those are the ones down below here when there's a terminal bud intact, that's suppressing the dormant buds. And latent buds, which are often lower down on the branch, or they're sometimes hidden underneath the bark. Sometimes they can be encouraged to grow by pruning off the terminal ends of the stems and removing these terminal buds, which will release hormones that will, or stop releasing hormones that will allow the buds down below to start growing. Apical control is the dominance of one particular bud over another. That's all that means. And reaction wood is the development of a different kind of wood that's a little bit stronger when there's pressure put on it. So if there's a large branch with a lot of weight on it, a lot of times the branch will develop a denser, stronger wood to compensate for the extra weight. As well as compression wood, which is often developed when a tree is leaning. Oftentimes the roots will develop this compression wood, which will help it maintain itself upright, even though there's a lean to the tree. So there's some different kinds of wood that develops. This is the 2 kind of growth habits that trees have. Either they're excurrent, which means that they have one single leader and develop this pyramidal shape, or they have multiple leaders, which is this is called decurrent. So it's 2 different growth habits that are common to trees. So it's important to know what kind of growth habit your tree has and to maintain that. If you see a tree that's supposed to have this single leader and there's 2 or 3 leaders that are vying for dominance, you need to prune out all but one of them leave the one that is the most dominant so that it continues this pyramidal type growth. Not so obviously important here, but it's important to know that trees that have this decurrent growth are pruned in such a way that maintains this type of growth habit. And trees develop different types of branching structure. So here on the left is a very tight, very upright growing growth habit that the ornamental pears develop. These very tight crotches that they develop are very weak and often break out, as opposed to trees like London plane trees and sycamores, which virtually don't need any help with pruning out these bad branches like we have on the ornamental pear. We've got these sycamore trees that have wider branches and which are stronger branches. And so every species is a little different. So it's important to recognize that as well. And then there are some trees that, really just have terrible branching habit. This is a weeping type tree, and that sustained a lot of storm damage during an ice storm. So very weak type of branching habit, and therefore that's why you have a lot of breakage. Pruning a tree like this before we get into a winter situation to relieve some of the weight in the branching might have helped this tree. And then we have the various stem attachments. You can see here, this cross section here shows you just how important and how trees are actually engineered to be quite strong when they have a lateral branch. It goes deep into the trunk of the tree, which the branch grows out of. These are the typical branching stem attachments. There's alternate, there's opposite branching, and there's whorled branching. So it's important to recognize that in trees, know what your tree's branching stem attachment is and maintain that. This is the reason why it's important to remove dead branches. If this part of the branch was dead for quite a while, decay started to set in and it started to move into the middle of the trunk of the tree. So it's always important to remove dead branches because they're all connected internally. And making proper cuts is important. On the left here is a cut that's improper. It's too close to the trunk. A proper cut is made a little bit outside of this branch collar. This is not, we're not going to cover this in any great detail, but there is a right and a wrong way to remove a branch so that it heals properly. And this photo here is showing an old tree wound that just, it's trying to heal, but because the cut was made flush, it's having difficulty. So proper cuts are always important. Knowing what to do and what not to do is important. These trees were topped. You can see here that somebody came by here and just cut them all back. What that does is it encourages a lot of shoot growth. This was done a few years ago, and this was the results. This results in a very top-heavy tree, a lot of weak branches. These epicormic shoots, which are quite abundant, are very weak. And these trees need to have some pruning done to identify most of the branches that are very weak should be taken out, and only a few. So it's just a big mess and it should not be done. So this is just an example of what not to do. It also stresses the trees out and can cause them to die prematurely. Another thing that branches will tell you is the state of health of the tree. Oftentimes when we see a lot of dead branches up in the crown of a tree, it's indicative of a problem with the root system. So branches a lot of times can tell you what the state of health is of a tree. And I talked about the epicormic branches from the tree topping, but these branches on these trees are an indication of stress. These trees were severely cut back. They were trees that were growing in the area originally before the buildings were put in, and they were severely cut back. There's a multitude of these sprouts here that will need to be addressed. It's really also, it can also be an indication that there's a other stress problems such as an insect infestation, a disease, or some other issue going on with soil compaction, perhaps something with the root system. But a lot of trees will produce this prolific amount of shoot development when they're under stress. And we'll talk a little bit about leaves and all the different types of leaves. Leaves are, this is a cross section of the leaves. We're not going to get into the details of what each section does, but the important thing to remember is that the main function of leaves is food production, and the process of photosynthesis, which takes carbon dioxide, water in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll, and turns it into food, which is starch and sugars and oxygen. So you get sugar production, oxygen production as a result of photosynthesis. So that's why the leaves are important. So like I just said, photosynthesis is the end result of sugar and oxygen. Respiration is sort of the opposite. It's the breaking down of the sugars and starches to produce energy. There are products that are produced from that process. In the process of respiration, carbon dioxide is produced and released, as well as water. So, and that all is important for a healthy tree to happen. Let's talk a little bit about what makes trees decline. Basically, trees need some resources. Water, essential nutrients, and light are the most important resources that a tree needs. Stress occurs when something limits the ability of a tree to acquire these resources or causes photosynthesis to decline, such as an insect eating the leaves, like the gypsy moth, or something covering the leaves, or shading the leaves, or when respiration exceeds photosynthesis. In other words, when photosynthesis is cut back and respiration, which is the breaking down of the sugars and starches into energy, then we have a problem with the tree. So this is a normal process that goes on. But when things don't go right, we get into a situation of trees declining. And we talk about the mortality spiral. It's a downward spiral. Nothing lives forever. As trees grow older, they use up more energy than they produce, and they're less able to defend against insects and disease problems, less able to compartmentalize old wounds. Damage and stress accumulate over the tree's life. The trees begin to decline due to an accumulation of factors. Some of these factors are genetics, changing site conditions, climate, weather, introduced and evolving pests, diseases, competition, such as overcrowding, weeds, invasives, all cause overcrowding. And therefore death may occur, but it may take many years or decades. A lot of times the decline of a tree and the eventual death of a tree can take many years to occur. Sometimes it's factors we don't even realize are happening, such as air pollution, for instance. Leaves are affected by air pollution, smog, In New York City, automobiles burning oil, coal. Sometimes we don't even recognize the symptoms of it. Oftentimes it's a what they call flecking on the leaf surface or discoloration of the leaves. Sometimes dust and toxins can cover the leaf and smother them. Sometimes insect presence can do that. Sometimes trees develop sooty mold, a black coating on the leaves, but it's from the excrement of sap-sucking insects like aphids and scale that drops on the leaves below, and a black sooty mold grows on that sugary substance, and that coats the leaves, shades the leaves from sunlight, reduces photosynthesis, therefore reduces sugar production, and the trees slowly decline over time. Or sometimes it's situations that damage foliage. This is something that happened this summer. Brown needles, stunted yellow foliage, premature fall color, leaf scorch, twig dieback. These are white pines. This occurred in the summer just after the storm that we had, Asais. And that storm brought a lot of salt-laden mist, salt spray, and deposited it on trees and shrubs all over Long Island. It just so happened that the white pines are the least sensitive. They're the most sensitive to salt, and the least. They're also. I'm sorry. They're the most sensitive to salt, and they're also sensitive to road salt. So situations like this can also happen when we get a winter, lots of snow, the roadway on the left is salted and traffic is zooming by at 55 miles an hour or more. That salt-laden water gets kicked up in the air and blows onto plants like the white pines, and it dehydrates the foliage. White pine happen to have a very thin epidermis to their leaf, and so salt dehydrates the leaves. They recover from it, they push out new growth, but if this happens year after year, especially if it happens successfully year after year, it does cause a decline of the health of plants like this and trees. You probably also may have noticed that a lot of the trees, the deciduous trees in our area, suffered leaf scorch right after the storm. We had the salt, we had some hot, dry weather, we did have some heat waves, and it dried out a lot of the leaves, caused browning. That reduces leaf surface, that reduces soil food production through photosynthesis, and so that does weaken the trees as well. And then, in an urban situation, we have all kinds of problems with the surrounding soil area. Oftentimes, soil compaction reduces oxygen level and the ability of moisture to be absorbed in the soil. It has devastating effects, especially on older trees like this, and it does lead to the decline of these trees. So it's important to keep everything in mind and what all of the different parts of a tree do, and the environment that they're exposed to, and the changes that occur in the environment. So we're nearing the end. People who will not sustain trees will soon live in a world which will not sustain people. Bryce Nelson. He's a doctor from Yale, and this is a famous quote from him about trees and people. People are important for the health and well-being of trees, but more so, trees are important for sustaining people. In the end. So if you have any questions, we can put that in the question box. And those of you that are looking for ISA certification credits, please put that in the chat.
Thank you, Vinny, for giving the presentation.
I think I went a little longer than I should have, but
most of our attendees have stayed on, which is very fortunate to hear. A lot of great information they were receiving. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A. A couple of these are personal diagnostic questions, so we'll start with the generic questions first. But one person had asked, why do some sycamores have knobby bark?
Why do some sycamores have knobby bark? I forget what that's called, but they develop these knobby, with age, this knobby kind of rough, undulating bark due to there were probably a bud or a branch years ago along that trunk, along the stem, that are no longer there. And the trees develop this kind of misshapen bark as they age. I forget the name of it. It's kind of an unusual situation, but if you take my email and send me the question, I'll be sure to look it up for you. So you can email me. My email is on this last page here, vad37@cornell.edu.
All right, our next question in the chat here is how, it went away. Just a minute. How far down can these deep descending roots typically go? Thinking in terms of roots that may impact sewer or water lines.
That's a good question. It depends on the species of the tree. Most trees probably are not going down any more than maybe 2 or 3 feet. And they're searching for water. And that leads me to the reason why people think that tree roots damage pipes or sewer lines. And the reality actually is the trees sense the leak in the pipe, because most often it's because the pipes are cracked or broken entirely. Especially, in our area, there's lots of old infrastructure. Some of the sewer pipes are 100 or more years old in some of these homes. And sometimes, or more often than not, the tree roots are actually going into the broken part of the pipe. So I don't know if that answers your question.
All right, our next question is, how does a tree obtain nitrogen?
Well, nitrogen is one of the nutrients in the soil. And as the leaves what naturally occurs, as organic matter decomposes, as the tree's leaves fall either on an annual basis or older leaves fall to the ground, they decompose, and the nitrogen that's in the leaves returns to the soil to be recycled. In an artificial situation like a landscape, we use fertilizer to get the nitrogen into the soil.
All right, our next question is, can you explain the difference between brown and white rot?
I don't know I wasn't prepared for that, but I will have to get back to you on that. So I won't even begin to guess at that one.
Our next question is, how do you tell the age of the standing white oak tree? I think that was the one that you referenced in the beginning.
Yeah, that is, I don't know how they did it, but that is what I was told at Planting Fields Arboretum by the horticultural director, Vinnie Simeone. So, and that was from a while ago. They can, they can take a core sample from the tree. That's sometimes what they do, but they also might have records of the property. from the past. I don't know exactly how they did that one.
I think that's going to be it for our questions. There were a couple more people that had asked some personal diagnostic questions. This is not something that can easily be deciphered through the chat. So if you would like any specific answers to a specific problem, definitely feel free to reach out to Vinny with some more details and images, and he'll be able to provide some more information about your diagnostic. But if we do not have any other questions, then I'd like to say thank you to everyone for coming out and listening in. And thank you to Vinny for delivering tonight's presentation. For any information about the upcoming webinars, once again, you can go to our website at www.ccenassau.org. You can also send us an email at nassau@cornell.edu.